Look, I know musicians who are afraid to say that they voted for Brexit. All right. I know comedians who are afraid to say that they voted conservative. There are people working in tech in Silicon Valley who are afraid to say that even if they didn't vote Republican, all right, they just think, oh, maybe they don't hate Donald Trump. Maybe they think, actually, he's got some good ideas. Maybe their parents voted for him, and they can't let people know that because they're worried about losing their job, losing opportunities, etc. And it's like that's insane. This is not to detract from anyone who has experienced racism or who has had bad times or whatever, but I find it amazing that that's the only side that certain channels want to give. And it's the same thing in the US, right? Always the same thing, always the same messaging, always the, woe is me, I'm so oppressed, everything is terrible, everything is racist, everyone is horrible, white people are bad. And honestly, like, I've reached the stage where I'm just tired of it.
Okay, today's guest is Zuby. As well as being a successful rapper, he's also a well-known and very astute political commentator. He's the host of the podcast Real Talk with Zuby and has appeared on basically all of the biggest podcasts in the world, like Joe Rogan, Rubin Report, Ben Shapiro's show, and a whole bunch of others as well. He's also got a ridiculously large social media following, so you've probably come across him somewhere on social media if you're on that sort of stuff in general. So yeah, Zuby, it's really great to have you on the show.
Hey, how's it going, Max? Happy to be here, man.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot for joining. I've really wanted to have you on for ages because you've got a really interesting perspective on everything, as far as I can tell. So, all right, I just wanted to. Why don't we start by? Could you just give me a kind of background about yourself and your kind of general political outlook, and then we can dig into what you actually think about specific issues and what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So background again about myself in terms of my life or in terms of my perspectives in politics.
Well, I guess kind of like a brief history of where you grew up, your life,
Okay,
and then also just kind of your general political outlook.
gotcha. So I was born in the UK to parents who are originally from Nigeria. I moved to Saudi Arabia as a baby. I lived there and went to school there. I went to an American school there up until fifth grade, so about the age of 11. I then went to boarding school in the UK, did very well in school, got into Oxford University, studied computer science there for 3 years. When I was in my first year, I started rapping. When I was in my second year, I released my first album. And then I moved to London, worked in the corporate world for 3 years, 2008 to 2011. 2011, I left my full-time job to go pursue my music full-time. I've been self-employed ever since then, so coming up to 9 years now. And yeah, I've put out 8 albums and EPs in total, traveled, performed in 8 different countries, done a lot of stuff, like pop-up shops, created a whole merchandise brand that's been successful. I released my first, in 2019, especially, things really started to branch out. I wrote and released my first book, Strong Advice. I went viral online multiple times. I started doing some life coaching and social media coaching, stuff like that. So I've got my hands in a lot of different pies. Also started my podcast at the beginning of last year.
Yeah.
And, that's been growing. Got a lot of great guests on, about to hit the 100th episode. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I do there. In terms of politics, it's kind of funny because I don't consider myself hyper political. I'm more interested in culture and society and where we're headed than I am in terms of sort of the nitty gritty of politics. But in terms of my views, they are and they always have been, I guess, by British or American standards. I've always been what people would relatively define as more conservative or libertarian leaning. It really goes from issue to issue, though. So I'm not someone who's like, okay, one of my views, and you can just sort of automatically predict absolutely everything else and infer everything. It's a lot more nuanced than that. So I kind of go from issue to issue. Some things I have very strong opinions on. Some things I don't particularly have a strong opinion on, and I
Yeah.
try not to speak on stuff that I don't know about anything about. But yeah, I always try to be calm, rational, reasonable. I'm open to talk. I'm very liberal in the sense of being what it's supposed to mean in terms of supporting free speech and allowing others to express their views and being curious and being open-minded, being willing to have conversations, being against censorship, deplatforming, all that kind of stuff. I'm very much free. free marketer in terms of both ideas and products and services. It's like let the best ideas win, let people speak, and we'll work it out, even if it's messy.
Yeah, so all right, so we should definitely get onto that. But so something which is a consistent theme throughout a lot of the podcasts you record and just a lot of the stuff you put out on social media and your commentary in general is, and something which I quite strongly agree with, is that there's something you've pinpointed is basically there's a particular narrative at the moment which almost every public figure or public kind of celebrity, media commentator, academic, and large parts of liberal and left society just completely uncritically accept or accept vast swathes of.
Yes.
And you are quite vocal in calling that out, not necessarily because you completely disagree with all of it, but just because you can't get your head around the fact that people can't see that agreeing on one issue shouldn't mean that you just uncritically accept all parts of the narrative. But so if you could kind of go into some detail about what it is you're referring to when you try and call out this like particular narrative which people sort of uncritically accept at the moment.
Yeah, well, that's a big question there. I mean, look, I support free thinking, and I support, like I said, I support the ability for people to have conversations and share their ideas and to participate in society and to be allowed forgiveness. And, so, I mean, you were kind of talking about public figures and celebrities and stuff like that. And I mean, don't you think it's kind of suspect how it seems like every celebrity has the same view on everything? Does that seem does that seem natural? How is it that every single rapper, singer, actor, sports star, etc., like how do they all have the same views? If you're looking at America, can they all be Democrats? Does that really make sense? Can they all hate Trump? Like, he won, so obviously some people support him.
Yeah.
Is it possible that everyone in Hollywood? It's like, no, it's not. It's just groupthink, and it's virtue signaling, and it's status signaling, and it's people trying to look good rather than do good, and it's people being dishonest and not being authentic in many cases, and being cowardly in many cases. I can't tell you how many emails and DMs I've received. When I say thousands, I'm not exaggerating. Thousands. I've received thousands of messages over the past year from people across the board, from an unknown school teacher in the UK to famous actors in Hollywood and well-known musicians who tell me, hey man, like, I actually agree with so much of what you're saying, and I love that you're saying it, but I can't retweet you. I can't like your tweets because I'm worried about losing jobs, or I'm worried about this, or I don't want this person to think that, or whatever. And so there is this chill that's been going on. There's this sort of collective cowardice. It's here in the UK. It's in America. It seems to be hitting the Anglosphere countries the most. UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these places which are supposed to be the freest countries in the world, and they are in many ways, but how free are we if people are living in fear to share a basic opinion on something because they're worried about losing their job or losing their friends or losing their family or being harassed or whatever? It's like, is that liberal? It doesn't strike me as it. Right? I mean, I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and people love to criticize Saudi Arabia for being not liberal in many ways. And I'm like, well, are you going to pretend that we don't have our own blasphemy laws here and our own things that people, just can't say? Like, if you go on TV and say a certain thing, even if it's I'm not even talking like something really genuinely offensive and radical. I'm talking about musicians. Look, I know musicians who are afraid to say that they voted for Brexit. Right? I know comedians who are afraid to say that they voted conservative. There are people working in tech in Silicon Valley who are afraid to say that even if they didn't vote Republican, all right, they just think, maybe they don't hate Donald Trump. Maybe they think, actually, he's got some good ideas. Maybe their parents voted for him, and they can't let people know that because they're worried about losing their job, losing opportunities, etc. And it's like, that's insane, right? What is that? Like I said, we're not talking about stuff that's like beyond the pale. We're not talking about people being secretly Nazis or white supremacists or something in the true sense. We're just talking about people with generally more conservative views or more libertarian views who aren't on board with lots of the sort of leftist stuff. And look, I think if someone's a leftist, someone can even be a Marxist, a communist, whatever. I'm not trying to stifle their speech. I'm happy to challenge those ideas, right? I think I can defeat those ideas with my own arguments. But when people are trying to silence others or trying to bully others or shame others, etc., then that's where a line needs to be drawn.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so something which really stands out to me about that, and which I completely agree with, is that so I almost think of myself as kind of apolitical on a lot of these issues. So just to take one example, something like Brexit, I wasn't massively in favor of Brexit. I kind of had no idea whether it was a good idea or not. I could see the merits to both sides.
Sure.
But it's just so unbelievably obvious to me as someone who's kind of taking a dispassionate look at the conversations going on around me in social media and everything that the unbelievably strong impetus is in favor of being completely against everything to do with it and labeling anyone who had any sympathy with it whatsoever as not just someone you disagree with, but someone who's potentially dangerous, as evil. And then there's a complete manipulation of language. So obviously there are some kind of really scummy far-right people who supported Brexit, but the vast majority of people who voted for it just chose one sort of direction in a two-part vote, which is quite hard to be sure about the perfect outcome for.
Sure.
And if it's been dismissed by large parts of the commentary as really disgusting racist people. And so it's not like I put this rabid commitment to Brexit itself, it's just looking at it.
Exactly.
It's like, it's the same with Trump. Like you can look at it dispassionately and say, okay, there's loads of stuff I disagree with Trump about, but how can there be such complete uniformity of thought?
Look, and it doesn't make sense because you know that, look, more people voted for Leave than voted for Remain. That's how Brexit happened. So how is it that the majority opinion is the one that is considered super crazy or impossible to understand, or the only possible idea is that everyone is xenophobic or racist? And never mind the fact that, millions of black and brown people probably voted for Brexit. I haven't seen the total breakdown, but some of the most staunch Brexiteers I know are, share my skin color. So it's like this whole idea is just bunk. And it's not just bunk, but it's totally uncharitable, right? If there's something you don't understand, why don't you speak to someone, right? If you are in the UK and look, I voted Remain, right? I voted Remain, but I totally understand why somebody would vote Leave, right?
Yeah.
I've got friends who vote. I know thousands of people who voted Leave. I know thousands of people who voted Remain. So it's not like it's impossible for me to understand both sides, or that I think someone is evil or racist or some kind of, terrible person because they had a slightly different take on it, right? Some people are just like, yeah, we just, we want to make our own rules. We want the country to be sovereign. We don't want to be at the mercy of people in Brussels who said, there was like, totally fair argument. Fair argument, right? Has nothing to do with hating any demographic, has nothing to do with any kind of bigotry or whatever. Just that simple argument alone, I'm like, you know what? I actually, fundamentally, ideologically, I'm more pro-Leave than I am pro-Remain. The only thing that stopped me from voting for Leave was that I think because, I don't want to spend too much time on Brexit, but because because people didn't really expect Leave to win, there wasn't a proper clear plan. So I thought, ideologically, I'm more leaning that way, but in terms of practicality and having a sort of plan going ahead, there doesn't seem to be one. So let's stick with the status quo. That was kind of my position. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in that boat. And as we saw, after 3 years of faffing around and switching prime ministers, we did see that, there wasn't really a clear plan. They didn't know what to do next. So, and this goes with many, many issues. If there's something that I really don't understand, then I try to understand it. And this is the problem. This is where things are breaking down and polarizing, is that a lot of people are not even trying to understand, and they're not trying to interpret things in a charitable way. They're just taking the worst possible version or the worst possible reason why somebody would do something or believe something, and they're kind of running with that. And it's very dishonest, and it tears apart society. It makes people lose friends, makes people lose family members, etc., over dumb crap. And I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I also think it's kind of amazing the way in which there are kind of a set number of things on any given issue which most people think as kind of like their central plank or central thoughts on that issue, which are the reason why they're so unbelievably strongly opinionated on it and see the other side as so evil.
Yes.
But so much of the time, there'll be some validity to some of those stories. But then if you actually look into the full picture, it's like they'll be a bit misleading. You won't be getting the full set of facts. There'll be a lot of assumptions which are made, which actually aren't very well considered. But it's just somehow kind of accepted in large parts of kind of culture at the moment, that these are the acceptable opinions. And then the second stage from that is, even if everyone accepts them as acceptable opinions, that okay, fine, that's what everyone thinks. But then it's okay, but because these are kind of evil, we should also shut down those opinions, and they shouldn't even be viable things which we discuss in public life. And that's the kind of second stage which you discuss, which is like kind of cancel culture side of things.
Yes.
So what would you describe cancel culture as, and what's your view of what's happened with that in general?
How would I describe cancel culture? I would describe cancel culture as a societal phenomenon where people wish to exile, punish, and or ostracize people who fall out of line with the thinking within a certain tribe. So cancel culture is not new. Cancel culture is as old as humanity, right? If someone, normally it would be something genuinely egregious, right? If you're living in a tribe, you're living in a community, in a village, etc., and somebody steals, murders, rapes, does something horribly wrong. If you're in a religious community and someone very, massively violates the tenets of that religion, etc., most religions have the idea of sort of excommunication, right? So you are no longer part of this thing. So it's kind of kicking someone out of a tribe, temporarily or permanently. In its modern day incarnation, though, what it is it's a very unforgiving approach to anyone who, not just anybody who sins, and I'm not using that, I'm kind of using that word because I think there is a religious framing to all of this. Not just someone who sins, but someone who is perceived to have sinned, right? So the person may not even have done anything wrong, but as you were saying earlier, if their views or something they say or something they do falls out of line of the very narrow window of what these people deem acceptable, then you want to cut off their source of income or get them kicked off of certain platforms or have them harmed in some way, not normally physically, but certainly socially, financially, in terms of their reputation, etc. And oftentimes it's quite permanent, right? It's not a forgiving aspect again, and it leads to this sort of witch hunt mentality, a sort of headhunting witch hunt mentality where people are trying to score points, and again, a lot of it is rooted in cowardice because a lot of people who engage in this behavior, they're terrified of the mob themselves. So they think that by running around and, participating in this circular firing squad, that they'll be the last ones to get shot, right? If I can throw you under the bus quicker than someone else can throw me under the bus, then I show, look, I'm an ally. I'm on this side. Like, look at my dedication to this. It's very, very tribal. It's kind of a very prehistoric mentality. It's just being done now with very high-tech digital tools. So now, you can participate in the witch hunt. Something can happen. Like, look at all these videos that go viral online, right? Something can happen in New York. And then you've now got people across the world trying to cancel the person who was involved in it and trying to find where does this person live? Let's call up their employer. Well, what do they do? And it's just like, good grief. Like, that's a very scary mentality. Like, some people think it's kind of funny, but that's the same mentality that used to get people burned at the stake, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's just this emotional, just a very disproportionate response many of the time, right? Massively disproportionate. And it's like, even if the person did make a mistake, it's like, man, is this the best way? Is this the best way as a society, as a culture to deal with this? Right? Why don't we first find out what was going through their head? Like, let them explain themselves before they walk into their job the next day and find that 5,000 people have called up and emailed their employer telling them that they must be fired because they did, it's like, do we even know why they did it? Do we even know exactly what they did? If they did mess up, are they sorry? Like, is this something that you can just apologize for? Like, assuming they haven't, murdered somebody or, committed some crime. It's just like, oh, they said an edgy joke, which didn't land very well, as if none of us have ever done that before. Or, yeah, they said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or they got angry at the wrong, and it's just like, come on, man. This is not the way This is not a healthy society, right? That's not a healthy way to deal with things, and it's not a good way to treat people either. It's not kind. It's not rooted in kindness. It's rooted in vengeance and anger, and anything that's rooted in vengeance and anger rather than love and kindness is not going to be good for society.
So you said that you think there's a kind of religious aspect to this,
Yes,
which
definitely.
I would definitely agree with that. But I think it also applies to that kind of particular left worldview at the moment, and I guess that's kind of interwoven with cancel culture and as a whole. So could you kind of go into some detail as to why you think it's a religious way of looking at stuff?
Sure. And when I say religious, I'm talking about sort of religious in a behavioral sense. I don't mean in a good sense. Like, I'm a religious person myself, so I generally have a positive view on religion. But what I mean is so firstly, I think that a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but I simply think it's true, is I think that the vast majority of people, there are always going to be exceptions and outliers. I think the vast majority of people have what I call a religious core, right? Something in their heart, in their psyche, which wants to, that strives to answer certain questions in life and to set certain rules, right? To have purpose, to have meaning, a sense of community, a sense of morality, right from wrong, in group, out group, belief in some kind of higher power, which doesn't have to be supernatural. So when I talk of this sort of mentality, some people call it, I don't know, like sort of progressivism, intersectionality. People call it now like sort of woke politics, the woke left, that kind of stuff. It's very religious in nature. So it's like a lot of these people have substituted the role of traditional religion with something that, in my personal opinion, is far worse, right? So they still have ideas of original sin, all right? That's white privilege. That's male privilege. Okay, so no matter what you do, you're a white male, so you've got to bow forever, right? You are privileged inherently. Society is set up against you. You must bow, and you must, you know, you must sort of appease the mob. There's nothing you can do about that. You've got cancel culture, which is like excommunication. Even in terms of the slogans and the chanting and the street demonstrations and all that kind of stuff, it's like that's their version. It's almost like their version of church, you know?
Yeah.
And so I draw a lot of parallels with it. So that's why I say that it's kind of religious in an old school sense. So if you think of like an old school or sort of a very fundamentalist, like very sort of hardcore fundamentalist religion, where it's like very unforgiving and sort of aggressive and hostile towards outgroups, etc., or even people who are in the in-group who err, that is what I'm seeing sort of taking hold.
Yeah.
So I'm a Christian, and Christianity, certainly in the West today, I mean, I might argue it's actually been diluted too much, but it's certainly not, I don't think most people would describe Christianity or Christians generally as being sort of like hyper intolerant or aggressive or whatever. But if you go back in history and you see a lot of stuff that was done in the name of religion, then it's like, okay, we've kind of come full circle here, and maybe it's not as violent or bloody yet, but it's the same psychological pattern. It's the same group behavior. It's the same mob mentality, the same desire to fit in, the same desire to otherize people, all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of why I use that. That's why I use that language in terms of describing it as being somewhat of a religious phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I also think that there's this kind of ability to shut out any alternative viewpoint instantly and just dismiss it as dangerous, which is
blasphemy.
Yeah, it is like blasphemy. So you can sound kind of a bit kind of uptight and like you're getting too het up about it if you're saying, oh my God, it's basically a new blasphemy. But actually, if you look at the situation at the moment, it's very difficult to publicly even just offer an alternative narrative to the commonly accepted one on a large number of issues. And I think that on loads of those issues, a large percentage of society will have at least some misgivings, but it's just obvious that if you come out with them publicly, you're in for a world of pain. And I think that's kind of where it gets its religious zeal element. Because there was a Cambridge academic who today said something like, or yesterday, something about white lives don't matter.
Yes,
And so
I saw that.
it's such a religious way of framing what you think. Obviously you can justify it with the theory behind it, because you can justify anything with large like amounts of theoretical like discussion, but basically anyone who says something like that publicly and is in a mainstream institution, and it's the fact that it's worrying to criticize her because you're going to get hounded by people is just a good
and Cambridge leapt to her defense, despite the fact that previously they'd prevented Jordan Peterson. They'd rescinded his offer to do some teaching there. So you know, this is the thing: the hypocrisy within the whole thing and the double standards are unbelievable. And look, I'm someone I try to be very principled, and I try to apply my principles very fairly and equally and consistently. And so one thing that that jars me, right, really jars me and makes me lose respect for people quickly, is when people don't do that, right? When people have different rules, totally different ideas of right and wrong, totally different sort of just totally different standards on different people. Okay, so that same academic, right? So she posted up, she said white lives don't matter. Okay, what if she said black lives don't matter? What if she said Jewish lives don't matter? What if she said Arab lives don't matter? What if any group other than white, any other demographic, any other racial group, ethnic group, etc., what would be the result, right? Not just from the university, but from the general public, right? How would that be tolerated? Would she still even be on Twitter?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
If you know, I don't think so. Yeah. I don't think so, right? The university certainly wouldn't be rushing to defend her. The whole framing is different, and I'm like, you know, and you get these people who are like, oh, Zuby, that's different, right? It's different, and I'm like, no, but to me, it's not. Because I have principles and I apply them equally. So if it's fair game to say one of these statements, then it's fair game to say the other. If it's not, right, if one of them is bad, if it's bad to say Black lives don't matter, which I would agree with, I would agree that that's a bad thing to say, right, then it's also bad to say white lives don't matter. It's also bad to say Jewish lives don't matter, etc. And the people who say these things around the world or throughout history, they don't tend to be the good guys, right? They don't tend to, right? The people who use this kind of language, right? They don't tend to be the good guys. So once you're sort of advocating that, or you're making these kind of statements, or you're saying whiteness should be abolished or cancel white people, you know, I have a very simple rule: substitute the demographic with any other demographic, and tell me how it sounds. If it sounds racist, if it sounds sexist, if it sounds deeply bigoted, it probably is. That's my rule.
The other thing is that you can use anything can be justified using like political theory, because taken to its end point, you could come up like everyone who's ever said that any group of people's lives don't matter. Like in communist China, it's like the middle class peasants' lives don't matter, or in Russia or wherever it is that they've said X group's lives or Jewish lives don't matter in Nazi Germany. Those people probably genuinely thought that they were making a good point and were acting morally, and they probably had some sort of theoretical justification for it in their minds. Yeah. But the fact that you can justify it doesn't mean that it is therefore something which we should be tolerating in public discourse because it's somehow deemed progressive at this time. Yeah. And I think that's a good example, because it's basically, it links to the misuse of language, because that's just such a consistent theme, I think, in terms of how the boundaries of discussion have shifted. And that's something you've talked about quite a lot. So maybe if you could look into that a bit, that'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. So language is super important. You know, I'm a professional rapper. So trust me, I know the power of words. I believe that words are important. And I think, again, I think people should be allowed to speak freely, right? All of these statements we've been talking about, I think people should be allowed to say them, right? And you should be allowed to criticize them and damn them for saying them, right? I'm not a supporter of, I wish the UK had an equivalent of the First Amendment, right? Because I think it's better than the alternative, even though it's messy. And look, I have faith in human beings, that I don't believe that the only reason people don't call me the N-word as I walk down the street, I don't think that's because of hate speech laws. I think it's because most people are not cruel, callous a-holes, right? Yeah, I don't think it's because, okay, we're dying to say it. We're all dying to be like these raging racists and sexists and homophobes, but we just don't do it because we don't want the police coming at us, right? That's not reality. Vast majority of people are decent, and vast majority of people will stick up for decency, and they don't like bigotry. So, yeah, I think in terms of words, it's a tool and it's a game that, look, I really don't like to use the term the left and the right because it's kind of plays into the division, but it's a tool that people on the left side of the spectrum have been using culturally and politically as a weapon very well, very effectively for a super long time. And look, sometimes it's fine for words to change. Words naturally change over time, but oftentimes certain words are used or certain terms are introduced purely for ideological purposes. So there are certain terms and phrases and words that I personally refuse to use non-ironically, right? I just don't use them because I don't even want to play the game, right? This is the best way to win certain games is just to not play, right? Like, nah, I don't accept your rules. Okay. If you want to have a conversation about racism and you're trying to tell me that you're trying to redefine the meaning of the word and you're trying to say that racism equals, it's not just racial prejudice, it's prejudice plus institutional power or whatever. Right? I'm not playing that game. I'm not playing that game. I'm like, no, we're going to use the proper definition so that you can't come with your nonsense of only white people can be like, no, like don't play the game. Just don't play the game, right? Say, no, like I'm not, look, we're going to use the proper definition and then we can have a conversation. If someone wants me to, like there are a lot of terms and phrases that I just don't use because I know they're so ideologically charged. And by playing, you're almost guaranteeing that you're going to lose long term. And this is something I think a lot of conservatives don't really understand, maybe because on average, more conservative people aren't as creative. But yeah, they always let the other side control the language. And I think that's a perennial mistake. Like that's an ongoing mistake. And I'm not in the thing of like, this is like a war between the right and the left or whatever, but it's like, it's a very subversive tool. Because if you can get people speaking the language and you can control the language in terms of what people can say and can't say and must not say, then once you can control that, then you can control thought.
A good example of that is how people use the word violence, for example.
Yes, great example.
It's like ideas have suddenly become violent, and it's not like they're talking about reading Mein Kampf or talking about joining the KKK or something. They're just talking about basically ideas which they disagree with, which they can theoretically position in some power structure as a violent way of oppressing that person. And then once it's become accepted as, oh, okay, well, I guess that word is a bit violent, that idea is violent, then it's like, okay, well, violence is a way of stopping people having their freedom, so we should just ban you being able to present that idea. And it's just
it also means you can retaliate with physical violence, right? Because if someone commits violence upon you, you are in your right to defend yourself with violence, right? If someone comes up to me and punches me, I can punch them back, right? So if someone commits violence upon me by, this is like the whole Antifa tactic, right? Because what do Antifa call their little marches and protests and stuff? They call them self-defense. Yeah, right? Exactly. They say defense. So
they call themselves Antifa as well. That's another excuse. I've seen some of them. It's like maybe some of them are anti-fascist in some situations, but if you're going around,
who are the fascists? Where are the fascists? I keep hearing about fascists. If someone can, I've met a lot of people in the world, man. I've met a lot of people. I've met hundreds of thousands of people. And I've met people of all political persuasions. But you know what? I haven't actually met a fascist. Strange that. It's boogeyman.
Well, again, no, I understand that point, but I do think that if there are situations where you go to these marches and there will be these really disgusting far-right elements on them. So I guess if you classify those people as fascists, I think there obviously is like a far-right threat, in my opinion, in the West.
Yeah.
But I just think that the use of language, so me and you might disagree on that, but let's say that Antifa describe themselves as anti-fascist, but that expands from protecting a group of black people from fascists, and it then includes them stopping an elderly Jewish couple going to a talk by Dave Rubin. It's like, that is actually, if anything, it's slightly more fascistic as a way of acting than just doing nothing. So the language, but once they define themselves as anti-fascist, if you oppose them, it's like, oh, well, you must be really right-wing, you must be really fascist.
Look, I have a general rule that, like, if you're out on the streets wearing a mask, padded gloves, carrying a baseball bat, like, you're probably not the good guy, like fair again. You know, once you're out on the street, sort of like beating up senior citizens and like blocking cars and throwing Molotov cocktails, there's probably been some exceptions in history, but you're probably not the good guy. You know, it's not normally how good guys behave. So yeah, you're right. It's just the warping of language, and as soon as you start accepting the terms, then slowly and slowly you start to accept the ideas, and some of these ideas just need to be rejected, right? Words are not violence, period. So like the word violence has a meaning, and you can't just take that and pervert it to mean whatever you want. That's just not how it works, and it's important to be precise in language. So people should be just generally people should be wary when people try to subvert and change language in such a way for their, to use it as a political weapon. And it's something I'm very aware of. Like, I'm hyper aware of it, and I don't think most people are at all. I think 98% of people kind of just go along with it. And some of these terms are not even things that are obviously subversive, but some of them are. So, for example, I despise the term people of color. I really dislike that term. POC is even worse, right? Like, I don't use that term. I will never ever, unless I'm telling a joke or I'm being ironic, I will never refer to myself as a POC or a BAME, right? Like, I'll say that I'm black, but I'm like, don't call me a BAME, a POC. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what are you? And when did these terms even enter the lexicon, right? Up until the age of or my early 20s, I don't think I'd ever even heard the phrase. Like, I'm not sure I'd even heard the phrase people of color, POC, BAME. And again, that's a psychological trick. Like, that's a subversive trick. That term is, the reason I don't like it is because it's simultaneously, look, firstly, the only people who need these terms to exist are like people in the woke left or actual like Nazis and KKK types, right? Those are the only people who need a delineation between white people and everybody else. Because that's all it means, right? People of color just means non-white, as if we're laundry or something. That's all it means. It doesn't mean, it's not specific. It's not talking about specifically Arab people or Chinese people or African people, etc. It just means non-white. Because oftentimes when I tell people I don't like the term, they're like, oh, what would you prefer me to use? I'm like, why do you need a term that means everybody who's not white? Why do you need that term? Never in my life has a time ever come where I need to specifically refer to this demographic. So what's even going on there? And people don't think about this. They just see they just see people using it and they just adopt it without any question. Another thing that's ridiculous about it is the fact that the term colored person is considered offensive. That's not PC, but person of color is supposed to be like totally. I'm like, that is stupid. like this is just syntax. Like, how can that would be like me saying, if you said, Zuby is a strong person, and I'm like, hey man, that's really offensive. I am a person of strength, though. You can call me a person of strength. It's just like, what is this? It's stupid. And no one thinks about it. People are just like sheep. They just go along with it. And I'm like, look, and as far as I'm concerned, it just creates more division because it makes people view the world as white people versus everybody else, because that's what the term means.
Well,
right? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, even the term black is now being used in a kind of theoretical sense to say that,
yes.
Joe Biden, that's just one example, but he's just basically giving voice to what the academics have been saying for ages, which is, yes, he said, you ain't black if you don't vote for the Democrats. So basically, if you didn't vote for the Democrats, he would now say that you don't even count as a black person.
No.
And it's like, that's actually not that out of the mainstream. I mean, Joe Biden's a kind of relatively centrist guy, and he's coming up with this sort of stuff. So it's almost like the terminology is meaningless because whatever the term is, they can just bend it to suit their particular narrative. And that allows them in turn to be, we should also get onto the right, because I do have loads of problems with the right as well. Sure. But I just always end up talking about like parts of the intolerance of the left. But it's unbelievably clear to me that public figures who are outspoken, who aren't white, get so much abuse, and loads of it uses explicitly racial language, which I wouldn't even say on here. Yeah,
Really?
You probably get quite a lot of it. But...
Yeah, and this is why some people are like, oh, how come you don't call out the right as much? It's because the right don't call me that. No conservatives or people on the right are calling me a house Negro or a coon or an Uncle Tom. Like, that's always from the left, and that's not new either. Like, for as far back as I remember, anytime someone has ever levied one of those things at me, normally online, it's always from someone who's supposed to be a liberal, supposed to be a progressive, whatever. And so, am I supposed to just ignore, like, if I've been called this 500 times and it's always coming from someone with the same, from the same, am I meant to be like, okay, there's no pattern here and the right is just as bad? I'm like, no, it's not, right? So you can talk all you want about this side being more racist or whatever, but I'm like, well, to use your own words, in my lived experience, that's just not reality. And it's not just me, because I can guarantee you, if you speak to any black or brown conservative, I can assure you they've all been called these terms.
Oh,
right?
yeah, they get so much shit. It's actually really amazing to me how commonplace it is to see it. I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it.
It's in a way, I'm glad people are seeing it now because of social media, because this goes back before social media.
Yeah.
Right? This goes way before that, but now it's like visible, so people can see. So I can show examples of when people are like, "Oh, what are you talking about there, Zuby?" I'm like, "This is what I'm talking about," right?
Yeah.
Because I'm just, I just share my views, right? Just like anybody else, right? I never, in my views, it's not like I don't put down black people. I'm not like, some people, oh, you're self-hating. I'm like, no, show me anywhere where I've ever denigrated black. Why would I? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, I'm a black guy. Why would I just want to denigrate myself? Like, no, I'm simply stating my views and I'm trying to be open and authentic. I'm just not a leftist. Right? Yeah. Does that where in the guide to being black does it say that I need
you're not black though, because you're not leftist. So
it's actually amazing, and it's even more crazy because I'm originally from Africa, and Africa is probably one of the most conservative continents in the entire world. So like this whole idea that sort of black conservatives are rare is also just factually totally wrong, right? It comes from a very America-centric worldview where they see that most black people vote for Democrat in America. And there's like, look, black Americans are like 40 million out of a billion, right? The vast majority of black people on earth, on average, would, if you could do any poll on anything, I could almost guarantee would be more conservative than the average white person, right? Like Africa is a much more conservative continent than Europe is, than North America is. And it's funny, like in Nigeria, I'd be considered pretty liberal. Right, I'd probably be more on the left side of the spectrum overall in terms of the society, in terms of my views, certainly in terms of certain social issues, right? So, for example, as someone who's pretty libertarian, like certainly from totally from a legal perspective, if someone's gay, like I don't care, whatever, like yeah, like let them free, let people do what they want, like I don't care, I don't have any kind of thing like that. Whereas in somewhere like Nigeria or let alone Saudi Arabia, like that's a much people are way more conservative on that issue, even on a legal level, not just a social level, but a legal level. And yeah, like me, I'm not with that. Like I'm more liberal than that.
So with another thing, which is kind of related to the use of language point, but I think it's just a kind of general observation, which I can't shake and which always seems kind of really central to me, is the fact that just because something is defined as the progressive view, I don't think people should fall into the trap of thinking that it necessarily is actually the progressive view. Yes, and so just to use one example of that, there was literally what seems like a homophobic attack in the UK a few days ago in Reading. I mean, it killed 3 gay guys who were completely innocent, who were doing nothing. We're not sure of the facts yet, but it looks like it may have been Islamist inspired. And so on the basis that it might have been Islamist inspired, it's been basically not really discussed as a homophobic attack. It's not really been addressed in the same way it would have been if it had been a racist far-right attack, which would, if there was a racist far-right attack or a homophobic far-right attack, and it basically wasn't discussed in ideological terms, I would be unbelievably worried by that. But almost every time there's a radical Islamist jihadist attack, it's just discussed as if it's a kind of random terroristic thing, which we should not look back in anger at. And I kind of understand the impulse behind that. But at the same time, I'm not sure that it's clear cut that it's progressive to not call out a murderous, homophobic, anti-Semitic, racist ideology.
Yeah, it's weird, and again, it's cowardice, bro. It's all cowardice. People are cowards, and this includes the media. It includes the media, right? Why won't certain media channels even have me on them, right? How come I can speak to certain media channels and they really want me, and then other ones like it's not going to be a peep. They know I exist. They all know I exist, but they don't want me, right? They want the black person who's going to come on and say what they want them to say. They say they want black voices. They want certain types of black voices. And this comes to something I sort of alluded to in a tweet earlier, where I said that I actually believe that systemic and institutional racism exists. It's just not what I think you guys think it is. And this is what I was sort of hinting at, right? Because they only want certain voices. They only want certain narratives. They only want certain messages, right? They want you to be the right type of that demographic, right? They want you to say what you want, what they want you to say, right? They come and woe is me, and come and cry about how horrible my life here in the UK is because of my skin color, etc. And this is not to detract from anyone who has experienced racism or who has had bad times or whatever, but I find it amazing that that's the only side that certain channels want to give. And it's the same thing in the US, right? Always the same thing, always the same messaging, always the, woe is me, I'm so oppressed, everything is terrible, everything is racist, everyone is horrible, white people are bad. And honestly, like, I've reached the stage where I'm just tired of it. And like, I've been tired of it for a while, but it's just like, I don't know, like I've reached the stage where I've just become so open about it, like my disdain for some of this stuff, because I think it's damaging. And I do think that it actually keeps people down. I genuinely think it keeps people down. And it's so funny because a lot of the woke types see the opposite. So they're like, oh my gosh, Zuby is not embracing why is he not embracing his oppression and playing the same game we are? It must be because he hates black people. And it's like, no, like I want black people to succeed. Like I want everybody to succeed. And I don't think the way you succeed is by, drowning yourself in what I call trauma porn and just like talking about how terrible everything is and talking as if it's, 1920 or 1940 and it's 2020. And also it's like, look, like in reality, I've never in my life, because a lot of people struggle to have any kind of nuance in what they're saying. So they think if you say one thing, they think it's either all the way here or it's all the way there. So I'll get people who are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said racism doesn't exist. I'm like, please tell me please show me where I have ever said or written that racism doesn't exist. Never, right? But also, do I think it's as bad? Again, in 2020, right now, I'm not talking about slavery. I'm not talking right now. Do I think that it is, someone who resembles me is going to, and I say the same thing to feminists who think that, there's this, we live in a patriarchy and we men are just, putting the boot down on women and what. I'm like, no. And it's such a pessimistic worldview. It's so pessimistic. I'm like, look, stuff is good. Stuff is great. Is it perfect? No, but it's great compared to most of the world, compared to most of history. We are literally the most blessed generation with crazy opportunity. Look at what we're doing right now. It's magic, right? Like crazy opportunity, crazy technology. Like the law has never been more fair and even across the board. It's not like, oh, you know what? Like there was a time where legally, someone who looks like you and someone who looks like me, like literally the laws are different, right? So you can work certain jobs, I can't work them. You get paid a certain amount, I get paid less. And it's just like, that was awful. And we can recognize that still has some impact on the modern day, especially perhaps in the US. But to sort of perpetuate this narrative, this victimology, and just keep people wrapped up in that mindset forever, it stokes division, it stokes resentment, it stops people from achieving, it stops people from even trying to achieve. Because if the game is rigged, why would you even want to play? And fundamentally, it keeps down the same people who, these progressive types are claiming to want to lift up, right? It just keeps people weak, keeps people needy, keeps people voting, and it keeps the votes coming in, right? So and that's why I find the whole thing just very insidious. Like, it's just like I see through it, and I'm just like, I'm sure some people mean well, but yeah, it's not working.
Yeah, well, it's definitely something which once you see through it a bit, your life is just never relaxing, basically ever again, I think.
No.
But I mean, I wanted to make on that point, I think that there's a danger of, because loads of people aren't actually hypersensitive to this stuff, they just feel this kind of vague sense that it's the right thing to think.
Sure.
They don't actually know what the ideological underpinning of it is. Which I think means that people like me and you can get really obsessed with pointing out the kind of berserk elements to it, and then be reluctant to. It's a bit of a depressing way to end up thinking, because I'm constantly so aware of the misinformation and the lack of nuance and the lack of accuracy and the way which people are just going along with the narrative, that you end up making those points when there are other points which the left, I think, the kind of traditional standard left view of the world is actually good at picking out problems with society, which the right often misses.
I agree with you.
And so this is a perfect example of that at the moment, which is, I really think that there are profound issues affecting Black America. And I really don't think it makes any sense to say everything's fine and we should just keep it as it is, because I'm sure there are changes which can be made. But at the same time, I'm really reluctant to just accept assertions which are really vaguely made and basically don't stand up to scrutiny because they're on the right side of making a change happen. Just to use one example, the statistics about police violence, the police violence is a complete disgrace, but the way it's being presented is massively disproportionately affecting Black communities. Once you look into it, it's not as clear cut as it's being made out. No. And so to call that out isn't an attempt to say that nothing's wrong. It's just an attempt to have an actually accurate conversation. Otherwise you just go to the other extreme, which so how do you approach that?
Look, this is one of the look, firstly, I agree with you, right? I think that it's important to have the problem with political polarization is it stops stuff from getting done, right? That's a big part of it, because people on to use the simple terminology, people on the right can easily see the blind spots of people on the left, and people on the left can see the blind spots of people on the right. So if you actually want to see the whole picture, you need some diversity of opinion, right? Yeah. Because there will be certain issues that I'm not aware of, or certain things that I can project into the future that I will see that some of these progressives won't. You know, if someone is like super duper, like super mega right wing, right? They're going to have blind spots in terms of certain things, even in terms of some aspects sometimes of just like genuine sort of like fairness and equality and whatever, or looking out for people in certain positions, that someone who's more liberal or more left-leaning can be like, hey, you know, like there's some people here who are kind of getting left behind, or who things aren't totally equal for, or whatever. So you actually need this dialogue to be constantly going on. And a big problem I see with the sort of the modern left, especially in the past decade, one of my biggest criticisms of them is they overplay their hand all the time. Right. So instead of just like pushing it to the level where everyone can agree, they take it so far beyond that I now have to reject what they're saying. Do you see what I mean? So take any of these issues. You were talking about the police brutality issue. OK, nearly regardless of someone's political position, almost everybody decent agrees that racism is bad and the police should not brutalize or kill citizens unnecessarily. Everybody agrees, right? It's not like conservatives are pro police brutality and pro racism and the left is against it. It's like, no, everybody agrees on those. But instead of saying that, instead of looking at the statistics and like you were saying, and analyzing the problem and talking about it openly, it becomes, this is the reality of Black men. This is the reality of Black people in the USA. They can't go outside without being lynched. Right? The police are just riding around murdering Black people. We see this every day. The cops are I saw AOC say that the police are one of the biggest killers of Black people in the US. These are just lies. You know what I mean? It's so hyperbolic and emotional but it's like, look, that doesn't help, because as soon as you start going that way, I'm like, well, and, you know, or defund the police, right? So how do we end police brutality? Get rid of the police, abolish the police. I'm not with you anymore. Do you see what I mean? Like, I was with you. I was with you like at the beginning, but you've overplayed your hands so hard that I'm like, well, I can't support defund the police. I can't support, right? And I can't support the narrative that I can't even go to America because like the cops are just going to see me and shoot me on sight. It's like, look, this is not helpful.
I was listening to one of your podcasts last night to prepare for this. I can't remember which one, but you made a point so I've been kind of really critical of this cancel culture stuff. But one of the things you said, which I hadn't really thought about that much, is that I actually don't really have that impulse to silence people I disagree with. I think like, oh, I wish I'd just shut up. But that's different to actively thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to try and get them fired and taken off of social media, even if they're really anti-Semitic or coming out with some really crazy, like nuts stuff. I never really go to the, oh, I need to ban that person as my first instinctive response. And you made the point that that's just kind of embedded in the way that this cancel culture, especially on the liberal left side of things, is going at the moment, is that's just a kind of way you're almost expected to respond when something challenges the point of view. And so it's weird because it's kind of like people are conditioned at the moment just to go to that as the default.
Yeah. And, and you may be relatively rare in that regard, but I certainly think, for the vast majority of people, if they are being, challenged, if they're being confronted with something that they don't like, the natural desire is to silence it, to stop it, to attack it. That's the natural reaction for most people. So I can understand there's a lot of stuff that I can understand from a psychological perspective, as much as I may totally disagree with it, right? I can understand the desire for cancel culture. I can also understand the sort of, the mob mentality, whether in the real world or online, right? I can understand the mentality of people who want to go out and riot and set buildings on fire and loot places and stuff. I can understand it, but I totally condemn it, right? Like I can understand why, man, like I can understand a lot of stuff that I wish I couldn't understand, right? I can understand a lot of like atrocious, murderous behavior that happens now and has happened throughout history. I can understand it from a psychological perspective, but it's still wrong, right? It's just wrong. And I fear that we can't start making excuses. Again, as someone who thinks that, look, I believe that whatever, like we as a society and a culture, we sort of decide what tools and weapons you can bring to the game. Okay. And as soon as you start bringing certain tools and weapons, you have to recognize that they can be used against you. Okay. So if you want to play certain games, then you can't be shocked when the opposition, whatever side you're on, when the opposition is like, okay, well, you used that card on me. You hit me with that weapon. So I'm going to use that same one on you. And that's what people really need to be careful of, because all of this stuff, it can always go both ways. It can always go both ways. And if people are genuinely worried about, if people are genuinely worried about the far right, which fortunately has been quelled pretty well for the past decade or so, like, then the far left need to be kept in check, because the extremes feed off of each other. The far right and far left aren't that different, right? They're in terms of tactics, in terms of the type of people who are drawn to them, etc. It's a very similar thing. It's both very, it leads to violence, it's authoritarian, it's intolerant, etc. And when one springs up and is not reined in, then the other one tends to spring up, right? If a genuine far right, like massive presence springs up, then you will get like, Antifa types rising up against it. If Antifa types are rising up and causing all these problems and no one is dealing with them, then you will get, look at what happened even just in the UK, right, with the statue thing, right? And that was predictable. It was like, look, if people keep pulling down these statues and defacing them or whatever, you're going to get a bunch of these lads, right? You're going to get a bunch of lads with like, shaved heads and England flags, and they're going to come out and they're going to want to fight. It's lo and behold, it literally happened just as, just like that. And it's this reactionary back and forth. So again, I just think people need to be very careful of that, and they need to think about what tools they're bringing, because they can always be turned against you.
Oh, that is such a great point to end it on. I also completely agree with that. But I always forget to say this, so everyone who's watching this, just click subscribe, hit the like button, leave us some comments, and also if you're listening on a podcast, give us a good review and a rating. All right, Zuby, that was really great. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.